So last week, in talking about the development of Christian values, somebody mentioned to me that the term values was coined by Nietzsche, which is interesting. It's a perfectly good term, and I think we certainly, understand it, and we certainly adopted it. But Nietzsche is not exactly, I think, the most influential of philosophers in the Orthodox world. Anyway, so we started last week looking at the Ten Commandments as one of the sources of our values as Orthodox Christians. So we got through the first four. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make unto thee any graven images. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And so we were just getting to honor your father and mother, and so forth. And talking about honor your father and mother, what is the value statement that we would come up with from that is that the church stands absolutely fast for the values of family, of marriage, family, marriage between a man and a woman, that might be fruitful and bear children. But family also includes the extended family, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and all sorts of relationships. Of course, in the church, we also have a parallel system of family, and that's the spiritual family. The godparents, sponsors at a wedding, sponsors in the priesthood, sponsors in monastic life. All of these become spiritual relatives. And in fact, in the canon law of the church, it talks about there have to be 6 degrees of separation, either from your natural family or from your spiritual family to be married. So you can't marry your godparents or their children or their grandchildren or their aunts, uncles, cousins until there's 6 degrees of separation. Of course, now I don't know what legally it is. I mean, certainly I don't think marrying your cousin is exactly the first, which would be two degrees of separation, I think. But I don't know, is it even legal in the United States to do that?
Very certain cases. I think nothing closer than second cousin.
Yeah. So the church's rules on that are actually, our society is so large we don't really think about that for the most part. But once in a while we have to confront this as we look at marriages and other things that form those permanent relationships. One thing also that's unusual is that you're not supposed to have a relative be your godparent, although on one hand, I mean that's been a common thing, throughout many different cultures. It's too close. It's like a double relationship. It's not really incest, but it's the church does not encourage that, does not frown on that. So should be somebody else from within the community. Those spiritual relationships are very important. Especially, of course, godparents for children. It's a very, very important relationship, and it's one that the church wants and has designed, as it were, that it would last a whole lifetime. That the sponsors of a child in baptism become like a second set of parents. And in many places, that's how that relationship is lived out in traditional cultures. I think it's important to remember that Orthodoxy has not just lived in modern urban culture. It's been throughout the world in very sophisticated urban cultures, but also out in the country and in very rural and very undeveloped areas. And so the application of these rules for relationship are honored both in a rural area as well as the urban areas. And in the rural areas, they're probably even more important because people are more conscious, at least in our culture, what's left of it, of their relationships. Whereas in the urban areas, people are becoming more and more autonomous individuals. Honor your father and mother. That filial responsibility is something that the church recognizes as something sacred. That we are bound to care for our families. We're bound to care for our parents. In the Bible study class, in the past couple of weeks, we've been going over the epistles to Timothy. And one of the things that they talk about in great detail, that St. Paul talks about to Timothy in great detail, is the office of widows. Now, the widows were, according to St. Paul, not to be enrolled in the order of widows, which was an institution within the church, unless they were over 60 years old and they had absolutely nobody to support them. But that if they had relatives, it was the bounden duty of those relatives to support the widows in their families and not to make them be a burden on the church. And he goes so far as to say that widows should not be enrolled if they have children or relatives who can support them, and that if a woman has widows, I would assume either in-laws or aunts or not to mention a mother, that she should support them as opposed to making them a burden on the church. Now, the office of widow was something that was the precursor of monasticism, and probably the most important precursor of monasticism, because these women lived in community. They were entirely supported by the church. They did various and sundry functions around the church. They would probably do, well, we have the example of Dorcas. Remember in the book of Acts, how you had the widow Dorcas, or Tabitha, who St. Peter raised from the dead, and how important her acts of mercy were in regards to the poor, in regards to the other widows, and things like that, where she would make clothes and things for them, and so it was a charitable ministry for which the church supported them. You have to also, we're so used to having a social net. If somebody falls into hard times or whatever, we have we have welfare, we have all of these various social service agencies and all of this other stuff. So that, you know, when we think of charity, we think of writing a check to an institution as opposed to giving money and or food or whatever into the hands of somebody and smiling and you know, assuring them that, you know, that we're there for them. And that's one of the most important parts of real charity is that personal contact, because what it does is it recognizes them as a person. The institutionalization of it as a function of the state started in the 20th century. Before that, it was always the church in the Christian world, and mainly the widows.
Sure about that, Flavika? Because in England they had the poor laws after Henry VIII dissolved the monastery. So suddenly the king found that the poor were his problem and not the church's problem.
Yeah, well, that's one of the problems with Protestantism. They dissolved the monasteries, and so they dissolved the entire social service network of the society. So honor your father and mother. You know, honor family. Family is very important. There's another kind of family that the church is strongly endorses, and that's the monastic family. Nowhere in the tradition of the church is there any kind of blessing for adults to live alone. Our society is a disaster where more than 40% of adults are alone. Most, of course, are divorced. Some have never married. Some may have had serial relationships, but never a marriage that worked. And of course, there are some that are widowed. But to have in society to have 40% of adults being single is something the world has never seen. No society in the entire history of the world has ever seen that.
Is that just in this country? Or
That's the United States. I imagine it's pretty similar in Europe. You know, the industrialized West. And part of that is the breakdown of the family. Now, one of the there's a later commandment, thou shalt not steal, and that would be connected with that, and that's all about communism, because communism is based on theft and it's based on envy. Communism is nothing that the church can bless, because it's fundamentally destructive, and in reality it's not just envy and theft. It's based on hatred, and we can see that now. You know how groups are being manipulated by hatred in their relations with other parts of the society, and by envy. You know, the poor envy the rich, and so the poor hate the rich, and you know, and all of this narrative of oppression. That's straight out of the Communist Manifesto.
Like being like a victim, or
What's that?
like maybe like victim mentality?
The victim mentality. Because you adopt a victim mentality and you automatically adopt powerlessness. And they understand that, the communists understand that very well. So they want to make everybody a victim and sow discord within society. And that That's been done very recently. I just look at how the BLM movement worked, and then you've got, and I mean, then you have the leaders of that movement who were anything but oppressed after stealing $89 million out of that.
And no tax representative?
Oh no. Well, of course there was no taxes.
And then the victim mentality makes you dependent upon the government as
That's
your
right.
Lord and Savior and provider and
Yep.
all be all. And
Yeah.
It's also like in essence, anti-Christian
Right.
to embrace the victim mentality,
Mm-hmm.
because how can you see yourself as being made in the image of God when you think that you're perpetuating a weak, helpless, or worse, oppressed, which is a really dangerous way of thinking,
Mm-hmm.
person.
Yep.
So it's like an inversion
Yep.
of, among other things, just communism. These thoughts are all anti or inverting, the right way, the Christian way, or the Christian ethic, morals, of that and many other things.
Yeah. One of the things about the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia is that for many decades, for most of the 20th century, it was probably one of the strongest and most vocal and most active anti-communist organizations, not to mention churches, and cooperated very strongly with the government in relation to, especially to getting political prisoners freed, because so many were imprisoned by the Soviets and the other communist governments. That, but anyway, that's so anti-communism has very deep roots in this church. Doesn't mean that we're capitalist either. Usually the default in the Orthodox Church is monarchism, but that that doesn't exactly work very well
Try
here.
selling that in America.
What's that?
Try selling that in America.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they did try.
so Vladka, can we go back really quick to something you just said a few minutes ago? Okay, so you were talking about in the scripture, it doesn't necessarily talk about living this life of a single person on your own in isolation.
Right.
Okay, so from an old world standpoint or biblical time or whatever, in the ages past,
Mm-hmm.
was it not the case, because this is very much Americanism thinking, as soon as this kid turns 18, he's out of the house on his own, I'm not obligated to give him a roof over his head anymore, kind of mentality.
Nope. I mean, it's one thing when people are just getting started before they've married. Now, it used to be up until, well, in most Orthodox cultures, they had arranged marriages up until through the 18th century, and then things started to Westernize. Although there are still places where there are arranged marriages. There are different expectations in an arranged marriage, especially if you meet your spouse on your wedding night. But it's a different kind of relationship. Then it's not, this whole idea of romantic love and all of this kind of stuff. I mean, obviously, it's been there forever, but that's not the primary motivation, and marriage historically is not just about the relationship between two people. It's a coming together of clans. Because if you think you can't marry to the sixth, without 6 degrees of separation, you're not just talking about two nuclear families coming together and their kids, getting married. You're talking about you have to deal with clans so that there's no relationship in 6 degrees, and that's already way beyond a nuclear family. That's a clan, if not a tribe. The only difference, a clan is a collection of families, from that are related to one another by genetically by birth, and but they have to marry outside the clan. A tribe is a collection of clans. This is just anthropological language. And there's plenty of cultures that not only have clans, Western cultures, clans, but even tribes. Not just the primitive cultures, because they're ways of relating. Yeah. Now, one of the most important things I think about this is that, and this comes down to the difference between being an individual, in which you define yourself according to what makes you unique, as opposed to a person, which means you're defined by your relationships. You're somebody's son, you're somebody's brother, you're somebody's uncle, you're somebody's grandson, you're somebody's great nephew, and on and on and on and on and on. And each person is a unique nexus of connections. Even if you're twins, even if you're identical twins, which means you're genetically identical, each person still has his own unique relationships. And so what that does is it provides a context to develop your identity as not only somebody's nephew, son, but as somebody's father, as somebody's, brother, all of these different relationships. There's the spiritual family as well as a natural family, and the spiritual family can take the place of a natural family because, I have, my closest cousin is, Michigan or in maybe Tennessee. There's somebody, I think, or Maine. I have a cousin in Maine, too, actually. But that's it that for relatives. But so far as a spiritual family goes, that's what the monastery is. That's what the parish is. And it's and even a parish. You think about it. A monastery is a consecrated community. It's consecrated by the vows that the brothers take of stability to remain in that community until death. And then the consecration, the abbot is given a pastoral staff and ordained as to be the father of that community. But it's entirely familial language. One of the hymn that's sung at the monastic tonsure, we also used during the Sunday of the prodigal son. Make haste to open unto me thy fatherly embrace, for as the prodigal I've wasted my life. And and that image of the son returning, and the father waiting and then going out to embrace the son, and to restore the son who had fallen and had completely disregarded the family and his father and all that his father had done and all of that, but and had essentially renounced his inheritance. His father comes and gives it back to him. It's incredible. It's all of Christianity is in that parable. But so we have that, and And it's, the church is, and so it's so important. The church has no racial, no ethnic criteria, no linguistic criteria. There's no human divisions ultimately that can enter into the church. There's one race. There's the Christian race. Comes in a variety of colors, variety of shades, but it's a but this is essential to the Orthodox Catholicism, which is really technically what this is. It's it transcends. It's where there's neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, but all are one in Christ Jesus. And so that unity is also related to the parochial model. The monastery, you have that operative as the spiritual model. Of unity transcending all human divisions. In a parish, you do too. But in a parish, it's interesting. A parish is not a consecrated community. It's a parish that comes together it's a community that comes together to celebrate the Eucharist. But what it is, it's a community of consecrated communities that are consecrated by marriage. And each family is a little church. It's a consecrated community that is there, that is itself an image of the unity of Christ in the church, just as a monastery is, just as the whole church is. And so in a parish, what do you have? You have multiple families, you have multiple clans. If in a rural parish, you probably have 2 or 3 clans that kind of try not to intermarry. But in an urban parish like this, you have people from all, just every corner of the world, or at least every corner of the country. And so there's a little more freedom you're not likely to be finding your cousin. In most urban parishes, right?
Right.
It's a later problem, right?
What's that?
When the church grows, that'll be a later problem.
Yeah, that's a problem to have later on.
Monica, do we use the term domestic church?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. The house is a domestic church, the household,
As a domestic church,
right?
yeah.
And the head of the church, of course, is the father, and but. It's servant leadership, and that's very important. It's not about submission. It's about synergy. It's about cooperation. And so you have all of these households coming together to create a parish church and to create a community. It's a community of families. And of course, each of their members. But this is one of the things the Orthodox Church has always had, and which differentiates it from the modern Western world and the Western Church. It's always collective. It's a collective idea. Everything is collective. In other words, your salvation depends on my salvation. And my salvation depends on your salvation. And each one of us is linked as the criterion of each other's salvation, because we're saved together as one body. That's very different from Protestantism, where it's just me and my personal relationship with Jesus. Right? Totally different idea. But yet this is the idea of the body of Christ, and it's deeply rooted in the concept of the family. Because we all become children of one Father. and we all become members of, and we share the sonship of his son. So, you know, and this is not just about, you know, using, it's not just about the using the language of family. This is about real, actual sets of relationships. Now you look at what is, you know, what is the you know, the secular ideal of now of our society. It's radical individualism, complete individual autonomy. Well, and democracy means, and not just being equal before the law, but being equivalent, so that there's no difference. You're just a number on a sheet, and if somebody is needed for a job, you can get plugged into that job. If somebody is needed for a position, you can get plugged into that position, no matter what your skills are, no matter who you are, no matter anything else. Whereas in the old system, it was all about nepotism, right? Everything was about nepotism. So you went to the company or to the job site where your father worked, and you'd likely get a job there because you were the son of, you know, this employee who'd been there for many years and who had showed his, you know, his abilities and showed his, you know, and made a contribution to the company, and so would take on the son. And that, for example, while my first job was in a bank for Bank of America, before computers, what did I end up doing before I finished seminary and became a priest? I was working for my father. You know, and so many people I know, you know, have their first jobs have been for their fathers, right? Or in their father's company, or arranged by their father or by an uncle or by a relative. And so, you know, this whole network, you know, it functions on multiple levels. And this is the model of society. And it produces healthy people. Whereas what does the individual atomization produce?
Oppression.
And broken, lonely people.
I have a question. It's like it's a little off topic.
Sure.
But like my family, you know, they're like Roman Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
So like I know the issue, you know, praying with the heterodox, of course, right? But if like they ask me to, you know, can you lead us in the Our Father, would I? Obviously, I'd be uncomfortable doing that. But like, would I?
It's not a problem.
Okay.
We need to have a little talk with the young men, and not just young men, about Peter Heers and his influence.
I mean, even before that, because since I was like drawn to traditional Catholicism, even before that, like praying with, I guess the heterodox, they wouldn't really use that word, but still a problem for me.
The thing is, we recognize these other groups as Christian, you know, and quite frankly, saying a prayer like that together is not the problem. We can't concelebrate, we can't receive communion with them. We certainly don't go to them for communion, and they can't receive communion from us. But can we say a prayer together for people who are in need or in hurt? Of course, suffering. Yeah.
Can you define can celebrate in like a practical, like in my day to day? Does that mean I can't go to a different church?
Well, normally that's what it
Outside of
means.
Orthodox church?
That's what it means. And if you do, for some reason, say you're invited to some event, then you go, but you don't participate in the service. You don't get up and offer a prayer unless you have a specific blessing to do so.